Hi, thanks for tuning in to our Practical Nerds weekly podcast. I'm Shubh, and together with my partner and co host Patrick, we normally invest in founders in design, construction, renovation, and logistics technology. Many of our friends in the ecosystem wanted us to start a podcast on the built world, and in return, we decided to honor their request with a show about nothing at all. Hey Patrick, we're back again, man. How are you doing?
Doing great. Very pumped to hear from you today
Mm-hmm.
what we can learn from the logistics markets and what they are actually telling us about the future of the construction economy. And as you're somewhat a logistics guru,
Uh-huh.
not just in fundamental, but actually out there, having backed several good logistics companies, being close to very good logistics companies, I know I will listen.
Okay. I'm flattered, and quite astonished at that introduction, but I'll take it, I guess. So,
Good. Setting the bar here. And don't dance limbo under it.
I'll vault over it. You know, one thing to kick us off, it just struck me somewhere. I pulled it out of my memory archives, I guess. Do you know there's actually a very fascinating connection between the shipping industry and venture capital? Do you know the origin of the term carried interest?
I did not, but now that you give me this little piece of context,
Uh-huh.
it might have something to do with participating in the value of shipments. And
Yes.
if that's directionally right, I would go with the East India Company.
Okay, so you're kind of spot on, or pretty close, I would say. So this concept started around the 15th, 16th century.
Uh huh.
So think of the time when a lot of European empires were building up their shipping lines and they're building up themselves as naval powers and sending out ships to the New World, as they called it, right? The
Yeah.
Americas, to Asia, to Africa. And back then, and as we'll discuss now in some time, even today, shipping was a very risky endeavor, right? So all sorts of things could happen to you: pirates, storms, right? When you get to the other place, maybe the people over there are not so welcoming, and therefore,
This
you
really
know,
sounds like venture capital.
I know, right? I know, right? So what would happen for each voyage? Each voyage, the captain of the ship would be like, "Hey, you know what? I'm taking this enormous risk, right? I don't know if I'll be alive at the end of it, right? Or if my ship survives and I live to run another ship after this trip. So in return, what I want is for carrying this goods, all these goods that I'm carrying in my ship, I want 20% of the profit from the sale of these goods if it's a successful voyage." Now, isn't that fascinating how that
Now,
sounds?
that's also the definition of the term skin in the game.
I know.
Yeah.
So, and it reminded me, I remember reading about it, I think maybe a few months ago or whenever, when I was thinking about it, I was like, huh, how fascinating.
Wow.
That who would have thought shipping and venture capital have such similar sort of risk profile, and in the way we just keep saying things like carried interest and never realized why it's called carried interest. But that's
Learn
the,
something new every day.
yeah, I know.
See,
Right?
this is why I tune into Practical Nerds. This
I
is
know.
both practical and nerdy.
Indeed, indeed, right? So, yeah, so for I think for those of you listening in who are considering doing something in logistics or shipping, I guess you can all consider yourselves venture capitalists as well. I suppose certainly the historical background would suggest maybe you're not too far from doing it.
But hey, I was not bad in terms of the era when I
I
said
think
East
you
India
got
Company.
I think you got very very close, very
Wow.
very close. Yeah,
Now I have to say we did not prepare this, and I really had no clue.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
but you
You know,
gave me good you gave me good
I
tips.
actually, it came to my mind as the intro was playing, and I was like, hey, you know what? I'm going to use this one today.
Okay.
So, yeah,
Now everyone believes us that we are indeed unprepared.
yeah,
What we did prepare though was you and me saying, "Hey, let's actually use." So there's a lot of wisdom that surrounds the global shipping industries, and from people that have way more like operational experience in that. And so one of those wisdoms is that usually you can take the logistics industry as a precursor or a leading indicator on how general economies will
Mm-hmm.
be performing in the next 6 to 12 months. And so as we
Mm-hmm.
cover construction, renovation, a lot of technology that has to do with blue collar and installers and trades,
Mm-hmm.
that's a big part of the economy. It's, depending on who you ask, between 10 to 15% of the
Yes.
global GDP. So
Mm-hmm.
we thought, hey, let's actually do an episode about what the current developments in the shipping and logistics markets
Mm-hmm.
can forebear for us about what's happening in the construction adjacent market. So that's one. And two, um, we've actually done a number of logistics investments over the years, and
Yes.
sometimes we even get confusion. Huh? Why does Fundamental do logistics investments? So we'll
Mm-hmm.
reveal that later in the show why we do that, because there's a
Yes.
very clear and strategic connection there. And we'll talk about in the second part of this episode what kinds of models we find currently interesting, and specifically the topic of agents, that software agents that can help shipping managers, procurement managers, supply chain managers, warehouse managers, etc. So that's going to be the second half of the episode. So why don't you kick us off about like
Yeah.
what's going on in global logistics?
Yeah, you know what? What I'll do to kick us off is again do something I only started doing in the previous episode we had, and that is to actually share some stuff, right? So what I'm going to do now, and for those of you
I'm
listening
glad
in,
you start sharing.
I know, right? Finally being a bit generous. So, for the benefit of our listeners, what I'm sharing right now is a view of how the sea and rail freight rates, I mean, in this case, it's primarily sea, between China and the US have evolved from December 2021 to March
Mhm.
2023. And this is basically the cost or the price of shipping a 40 foot container from China to the US or vice versa. Now, as you can see here, in December 2021, which was very close to, oh, and by the way, just before if anyone is wondering why did I pick China, US, it happens to be the single most active shipping lane in the world.
It's the most liquid market.
Exactly, right? And it's also a very, very good predictor of where the world economy is at or where it's heading, which is why, for most people, as we'll find out in a few minutes, you can get a quick pulse check on where the world economy is heading by checking out the state of the US-China trade lane. So interestingly, when we check this out, I mean, we had some more graphs, of course. I wish I could go back a few years, but it's kind of hard to piece this data together. In December 21, we reached a high of looks like about $16,000 per container. And then in this first graph that we have, which is till March 23, give or take, it seems like it's fallen down to $3,000. Now, just to complete this view until the present, what I'll do is I'll switch over to another view. Yeah. So where we left off was early 23, we were down to about $3,000.
Mhm.
As you can see, we hit rock bottom around October,
Yeah,
right?
it
What
has
looks
plateaued since then, basically, for all the
exactly.
audio listeners. Like for the last year, it has bottomed out and plateaued.
Yes. So correct. So in other words, from a high of $15,000 per container in December 21, we hit a bottom of about say $1,700 in October 23. And I think the timing is interesting, and we'll maybe come to that. Which, as you may have, for those of you who have done the math, it represents more than an 85% drop, or the prices at the bottom were about one ninth the peak prices that we saw in December 21. And since then, it's plateaued. It's sort of gone up a little bit, gone down. If you hear anecdotal or in the spot market, there are reports that the rates are quite a little bit higher than that, but it seems to be picking up.
Mhm.
Now, the interesting thing here is it reflects many other things. Now, some of you listening may say, "Hey, is this a reflection of geopolitics?" It might be, but if you zoom out a little bit and think about it, it could be a reflection of geopolitics between US and China, for example, Russia, and how that affects goods movement, or how import and export needs of other countries vary depending on the situation in Ukraine, and also what's been happening in Israel and Gaza since October 7th, and how that affects goods movement. But I think my opinion, if you zoom out a little bit further, it also perhaps reflects in December 21, fueled by, for instance, a lot of stimulus checks in the US and a lot of money printing and so on, there was enormous consumption, right? An incredible wave of consumption, which is what fueled tons and tons of goods imports into the US and in general the world economy. It was a very liquid market in terms of goods movement. Whether we realize it or not, in most economies around the world, most of the goods we consume either have been imported from somewhere else or have had something to do with goods that were imported from somewhere else. So the more we consume, the more goods are shipped into that economy as well. And that's actually reason why the more robust the state of the world in terms of its economic health, the more liquid the shipping will be, and therefore the higher the shipping rates. Now, just to give you an idea of also, I mean, I was about to move into maybe a more real time situation, but let's pause and maybe in case you wanted to discuss this a little bit further.
So I think perhaps just the general observation of this tells me a couple of things. So first of all, we all know what a crazy, I don't want to say good, but like what an exceptional 2 years,
Mhm.
2020 and 21 were, both from the COVID shock as well as the reaction of the fiscal policies
Yes.
to it, and that culminated in many assets and services being inflated, of which shipping rates, like you have
Mhm.
shown, was one of them, but it was
Mhm.
also a leading one of them. Two,
Yes.
if you had closely watched in 2022 how the price of shipping rates plummeted because supply was steady but demand came down,
Yes.
you could have predicted already that the global economy is going to cool off, which is exactly
Mhm.
what happened. Now,
Yes.
we always tie it back to inflation.
Mhm.
Inflation is first a symptom before it becomes a root cause
Yes.
of this type of development in
Mhm.
the global economy. But if you had closely looked, anyone who has closely looked, like we have at this chart throughout 2022, would have
Mhm.
known this, right?
Yes.
And so, a year later, people were smarter,
Yeah.
and the ones that are in the shipping industry, they already knew this a
Mhm.
year in advance. So that's the second one. A third observation, perhaps, just to double underline what you showed. So it has plateaued. It has bottomed out. Like literally, if you have seen this chart, it's for a year plus minus a couple percent the same price range,
Mhm.
right? So we're talking here 1700 to 1900 US dollar per FEU, and that's bottomed out. So, Shub, what is now happening? What is the next thing we can predict from what's going on currently?
Yeah. So the stage I want to set here, hang on, let me again share something. So, for the benefit of our listeners, what I'm sharing is the view of a world map from about the start of the new year, give or take. So, 2.5 months, almost 3 months ago,
January 24.
January 24th. So, this is the view of the world map that was provided by the founder and CEO of Flexport. So, what this shows is the world map and what a position of all the shipping lines and the ships that were meant to go somewhere, and what proportion of these ships changed course in a certain at that point of time. What it interestingly
So the
shows,
color coding is you're seeing blue dots and orange dots. The blue
correct,
dots are ships that stayed on course, and the
Mhm.
orange dots are ships that actually decided to change course.
Correct. That's right. And the really interesting thing here, and keep in mind, as of early January, it was still a fluid situation in the Red Sea. I mean, different parties were saying different things about what the eventuality will be. But already by then, 85% of the ships, which their original plan was to go through the Suez Canal, go through the Red Sea, to cover the trading lanes between Europe and Asia, although that's not it's not restricted just to that, but primarily between Europe and Asia. 85% of those decided to turn all the way back and go through the entire African
Wow.
continent, right? Which is
Wow.
an enormously longer route. I would say about triple the distance, right? That obviously, for those of you who are interested in macroeconomic pointers, will start looking at this and say, hey, you know what? This means, firstly, demand for fuel increases. The shipping lines which probably were meant to be available after a much shorter journey, are now stuck at sea for much, much longer. So therefore,
Yes.
you have a sudden shortage of ships. So
Utilization goes up because they are longer underway.
exactly. And what we don't realize, as we mentioned before, in most parts of the world, lots of very important things powering our economies, our food supply chains, our basic essentials come through these things. So, it needs to get there basically. So if you have a situation where someone says, "Hey, you know what? I was meant to arrive tomorrow, but sorry, I can't make it. I can only come, 2 weeks from now or a month from now unless you pay me higher." Most of the time the answer will be, sure, I'll pay you higher, because it is an essential trade that's going on, and that is what causes rates to spike up in a very, very real time basis. Which is why also, as we've discussed, you can use it to predict likelihood of inflation, likelihood of some other sort of demand which may be playing into governments across the world.
It's a fascinating chart just visually. I mean, those who tune in audio, I can really only recommend look it up from Ryan Peterson, the CEO of Flexport, what he posted in January, or go on video with us, because what you're seeing on this world map is almost, I call it like a heart pattern. It's a heart or half heart pattern, because if you look at it, it looks like the left side of a heart, which
Hmm.
goes like from the Suez Canal through the Mediterranean Sea and then across all the western coast of Africa down to the Horn of Africa, and then top again towards the Indian Ocean and
Yes.
the north part of the Indian Ocean, which makes this half heart shape, which is absolutely stunningly striking on this world map. It's amazing to see this visually.
One interesting thing I want to point out, for those of you watching, you may have already wondered about this, but for those of you listening, yeah, Patrick, you must be noticing there's also ships over here which are coming from North America, the East Coast, incredibly, even some on the West Coast, some in the Pacific, some, just off the northeast part of South America. And some of you may be wondering, hey, how is all of that getting affected in this situation?
Hmm.
Well, I mean, a lot of these routes, don't forget, we just said China to US is the largest shipping lane in the world, right? And a lot of time, the shortest route still happens to go through the Red Sea. So it's something where it's often not obvious who it affects in the world. And 9 times out of 10, if it affects something, if the shipping industry it affects, the usual answer, it affects the whole world as a
Hmm.
spillover effect.
There you go. Now, this is not the only crisis that we have had in global
That is right.
shipping since the beginning of the year. So the Red Sea crisis that we're having it's become unfortunately a very unsafe shipping lane. It has since become a little bit more safe with the deployment of a coalition of international frigates and destroyers
Hmm.
around that part of the world, but still the threat does remain. Insurance companies would be a great interview partner
Hmm.
to discuss this with, because they will have a very live view of what's going on. And
Hmm.
still, it's not the only part of the world where the shipping lanes are currently getting reorganized. What's the other part?
That is right. So the other part, for our listeners from the Americas listening in, it actually hits much, much closer to home, and I find it quite fascinating that this topic isn't discussed more, because I think
Hmm.
it should, because again, it's essential for survival in the very literal sense for millions of people. So let me do this. Let me share another thing here. Yeah, so for our listeners, what I'm looking through is a study on the effect of the Panama Canal on supply chains. Now, for those of you who are unaware, you may be wondering, hey, what's up with the Panama Canal? I thought everything's fine there. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So I think the wider topic here may be quite difficult to get into, but in a very simplified way, the way the Panama Canal works is you move ships from one side of, or one end, which is the Atlantic Ocean, the other being the Pacific Ocean. You move ships from one end to the other by equalizing levels through a series of barricades, let's call them. And you do this equalization of water levels
Hmm.
by sort of letting out fresh water from a lake and a river system in the country of Panama.
It's massive locks.
Correct. So, in other words, every time a ship moves, to or from between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans to save a whole bunch of time and cost to just go through the canal, you are actually sacrificing drinking water that the people in Kanama could use, which, by
Hmm.
the way, happens to be the only source of drinking water for the people of the country of Panama.
So before you go, you gave me an interesting tidbit at the beginning of the show. Let me give you one. I'm not going to call
Okay.
it a fun fact because it's actually a sad fact.
Okay.
Um, take a guess how many people actually died building the Panama Canal.
Oh, so okay. So maybe I'll have to. I think the Panama Canal, if I'm not mistaken, was built sometime in the late 19th century.
Yeah, but over 3 decades. So it actually went
Over 3 decades. Okay.
into the new century.
That's okay. So that maybe changes the math a little bit. I'm gonna guess. So okay. So we have to add up the death toll over 30 years. Would it be like 50,000?
Yeah, you're not bad. So I mean, the official number is very very low, but historians agree actually that it's in terms of the canal itself probably close to 30,000.
Oh my gosh, that's very
Plus
sad.
the railway, which runs alongside the Panama Canal. I mean, we're not doing a Panama Canal episode, so read it up why there's actually a railway. It's also a fascinating tidbit in and of itself, why it has a
Yes.
railway. That's another 5,000 who actually died through that. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's construction in the
Mhm.
end, and how much death toll this has actually extracted from the
Yes.
local population. So now back to you. Now we're in a situation where the local population doesn't get to benefit from the Panama Canal again because now there's a drinking water problem.
Yes. So, okay. So, again, the economists in our audience will probably be wondering, hey, are you sure they don't benefit? So, again, truth be told, the Panama Canal is also the single largest contributor to the Panamanian GDP. So, I think we must acknowledge that. So, very sadly and very perversely, the country of Panama now is in this weird situation where they have to figure out, do they want to make more money or do they want to have water to drink?
Hmm.
Right? As morose and as disgusting as that sort of a trade-off sounds, right? So as you can see here now, I'm actually presenting a couple of graphs which show how many shipments are going through the Panama Canal. So in general, we see what is this? The general trend per year has been something like 12 to 15,000 transits are allowed per year through the Panama Canal. And then all of a sudden, in is this 20? This is probably 23, I'm guessing. Or maybe year to date 24 or something like that. Okay, so it's per annum, so it must be the trailing 12 months. There's like this sudden drop, which we haven't seen in the last 20 years, which is like half the total amount of transits. Now, this actually is not a coincidence. This is because the level of the lake from which the Panama Canal actually uses to drain out the water for equalizing the levels, it's at a dangerously low level where the population is at a risk where unless they take measures now to replenish the water, the drinking water could run out in a few years, which is why the government is now sort of throttled how many ships could go through.
Yeah.
And as a result, if you could, before we go there, just a quick recap. There's some very large countries and economies where a very significant part of their trade depends on transits through the Panama Canal.
Hmm.
Like the US, 14% of US trade goes through Panama Canal. One thing which we should remind our viewers and listeners, most of the goods from the east coast of the US to the west coast of the US go through the Panama Canal. In other words, it's not a domestic transport system, it's an international ocean based transport system that moves goods primarily between the US West Coast and the East Coast, simply because the infrastructure is developed in that fashion
Hmm.
over the decades and centuries. And what this means is if there's a restriction over here, so now for the benefit of our viewers, what I'm showing is a world map which discusses the impact of these of what this does to shipping lanes in the world. So there is a situation where if the Panama Canal is restricted, you'll probably just to move goods from say New York to San Francisco, you'll have to traverse the entirety of the South American continent.
Hmm. You're adding like 2 weeks to the journey.
Exactly, exactly. And if you're sending goods from say China to San Francisco, again, you have to perhaps go through. Firstly, you can't go through the Red Sea, so you're going through again the bottom of the African continent, and then you're
Actually,
again.
China to San Francisco is okay, but China to New York, like that's really affected.
You're right. You're right. That actually gets hit much worse. You're
Yeah.
right. I must correct myself. You're right. In fact, that is exactly what this map is showing as well.
So huge impact, right? And so this is actually um, a very few talked about aspect of climate change and how it
Hmm.
directly impacts the world economy.
Yeah.
So Shub, now bring this into the context for me about
Yes.
shipping rates. So
Hmm.
you showed us the trend on shipping rates.
Hmm.
Now we know what's going on in terms of what's happening on the ground or at the sea level,
Yes.
if you want, currently
Mhm.
live. So what do you expect to happen now?
To be honest with you, I do expect shipping rates to spike up. I think so. There has been a spike between October and Jan, and there's been another, or I would say a little bit of a spike. That's also largely because the expectation is things will be sorted, fixed, right? Consumption will be relatively muted. There's a few factors here. If you see a round of interest rates loosening or quantitative easing, for example, that could stimulate more demand.
Hmm.
If geopolitical tensions get worse, that would again throttle important trade lanes, which means shipping rates rise, which means more inflation, right, for the world. Um, if the situation with the Panama Canal doesn't resolve itself, and to be honest, I don't have an idea how it'll resolve itself. I think it'll need core infrastructure work and shutting down the canal for a fair length of time to actually resolve it properly. Otherwise, it's just a ticking time bomb. But doing that also means for that whole length of time, all the goods are more expensive, right? So I think all of these, I think the near term seems like shipping rates will continue rising.
Hmm.
Now, the interesting thing in all this, and which is where perhaps some of our listeners are wondering, okay, there's so much uncertainty, so much macro stuff that you guys are throwing at me. So what do I do about all this, right? I think it's quite fascinating to bring us back to what you said earlier. I think we're in this interesting situation where more than perhaps ever before, or certainly it seems like more than recent times, if you have, let's say, an AI agent which could process lots and lots of things happening in real time, give you real time ability to plan, right, what the right pricing should be, where you should commit your goods and shipping lines to. If you're a user of shipping lines, right, a customer moving goods, and this again brings us back to the relevance in construction, to plan better, right? For which segment, which geographies do you target? What sort of pricing do you target? Um, as a resultant of shipping rates changing, what effect does that do have on your pricing? You may be sourcing crucial raw materials from other markets. Maybe they're going to take much longer to get to what to your production line. What does that do to your overall production and delivery time that you have promised to your customers, right? Now, someone may say, hey, you know what, we could just do all of this, react in real time, etc. But I think it would be a shame if that's the modus operandi someone went with. I feel like at this point, given the tools available to us, you can potentially be in a situation where you can process information in real time to
Hmm.
provide much better visibility and plan ahead.
So we're moving now into the second part of the episode where we want to talk to you, where we want to talk to each other about like the role that software agents are going to play in the future of shipping, logistics, supply chain management. And let me actually take it from here, building on what you said with a metaphor,
Mhm.
an image, how to think about the job of a supply chain manager, a logistics manager, customs manager, warehouse manager. So take this image, Shub. So I think of logistics as if you were a farmer and you had like a huge field of crops.
Mhm.
Your crops, your yield is constantly exposed to externalities. There could be bugs, there could be a weather incident, wind, earthquake, you name it.
Yeah.
Um, Normally, though, this field of crops in the world, like if you transport it into the logistics, usually the overall field of crops is so huge that you're servicing that it is permanently exposed to externalities. But when an adverse thing happens, it happens to a small part of your crops, while the
Mhm.
rest is stable and okay. So, meaning there's externalities, there's uncertainty, there's unpredictability, there's volatility. But when it happens to one specific, you know, inch or square meter of your crops.
Yes.
So you will have to do, as the farmer and as the owner of this, meaning, the analogy being the supply chain manager and so on, you need to be constantly prepared. But when it hits, you deal with a section of your
Hmm.
field while the rest remains stable. Now, that's the normal logistics situation.
Hmm.
However, we've moved into a world over the last 3 years where your crops, to a large degree, the surface area of your crops is actually under constant threat because
Yes.
so many, like, your supply chains get reorganized. The
Hmm.
world reorganizes its supply chains on a grand level right now. And so, where 5 years ago you could count on a macro stability on the overall crops, and you only had to deal with volatility when it hits in a specific part of your field, now on a grand macro scheme of things, we're reorganizing supply chains. And on a macro level, it's volatile.
Hmm.
Interest rate environment changed. And it's going to, the way it looks, it's going to be changing again,
Yes.
actually, right? We have wars going on a scale in the developed world that we haven't seen in a long, long time.
Yeah.
So that's going on. Shipping rates due to Suez Canal, Panama Canal. So these shipping lanes get disrupted and hit. Ships that get pirated, that has been
Yes.
ongoing as well.
Hmm.
Raw materials that run out at the production site in the country you might be producing, that happens today.
Yeah.
So the point being, on a grand scale, what's really different for the farmer in this image is, compared to 5 years ago or 10 years ago, the overall crops is now actually under volatility.
Yeah.
And now try to be a farmer with, you're one man, one woman that needs to tend to this huge area of crops, which in the past you could do because the volatility would hit one part one day and you would have the resources to go there. Now it could hit everywhere all the time.
Yes.
So how do you deal with that? And one
Hmm.
of the fascinating answers that we have seen over the last year and a half are AI agents,
Yeah.
built on quite smart LLMs with great um, interfaces for supply chain managers to listen in to the different communication channels with their production partners,
Hmm.
their third party logistics providers, meaning carriers, with their
Yeah.
freight forwarders,
Hmm.
with the customs agents. So they are listening to the WhatsApps, the emails, the telegrams, and so on of this shipping manager or supply chain manager. They make sense of that and they create a dashboard of priorities for the shipping manager to say, hey, you need to reply to this, you need to work on this.
Yes.
Think of the following situation. Imagine your production partner in another country tells you, hey, I was supposed to use um, this component in your production, but it's
Hmm.
run out. I
Yeah.
can't get it over here
Hmm.
because, for example, the ship got delayed.
Yeah.
Do you want me to replace it with my alternative proposal? So this comes in over Telegram alongside 10 other messages of the day. And so now an AI agent actually elevates this as a very critical thing to respond to. And you
Hmm.
can train these AI agents then to actually automatically reply and take not necessarily decisions, but
Hmm.
take the actions, the execution of your communication back to your production partner, your 3PL, your freight
Yes.
forwarder, and
Hmm.
so on and so forth. So it's an incredibly powerful tool in the shed of the farmer, in my
Hmm.
image,
Yeah.
in the toolbox of the supply chain manager, the shipping manager, and so on, to make sense of a macro level volatile world where supply chain disruptions are more common than they ever were.
Absolutely. I think that's extremely well articulated.
Now, what can I say? I'm a farmer boy.
Well done, sir. Well done. Yeah. You
So
know.
talk to me. Perhaps we've backed one such company. Our
Hmm.
partner Adam in the US has backed Auba, AUBA.ai.
Hmm.
Um, what are perhaps you could explain in a few words what Auba is doing, and then like what are your thoughts on something like that for the markets?
I think the timing for that is very very interesting. I think I mean we're obviously biased a little bit, but we see a very bright future for the firm, and I think it comes at an excellent time. It's emerged as an important need for the market at this time because I think as you rightly said, it helps uh, the firms, both the shippers as well as the transporters interpret the documents and have it ready in a even resolve inconsistencies. I mean, what we haven't discussed, which perhaps is going too granular for this episode, a lot of the documents prepared for these ships to actually get clearance from the port authorities or transit authorities. Again, it's like a very old system. The documents itself are a very manual paper based method. That's what the port authorities are working with as well. So if you can sort of automate this whole process, you can also preempt any errors or any things which need to be fixed with the documents and then correct it in real time. You can perhaps speed up the clearance process. I think the other thing which happens
Hmm.
is just to for those of you who are not familiar, it's not as if a ship just shows up at a port or at a Suez Canal, for example, it's just automatically let go. So that's not how it works. So
Yeah.
think of it like how you would go through like a border control at an airport. The process is actually not that different, right? The difference here is that instead the nature of the ship, sometimes the crew, etc., and the goods they're carrying need to be reconciled, right? And if you can visualize the very very large ships which carry like enormous quantities of goods, I mean the picture coming to my mind, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers and listeners are familiar, is that evergreen ship which was stuck in the Suez Canal, like this monster ship. So you need to have the right documentation to reconcile that, and once you do that, you're let go. So it's not
And
a
the cost of not having that correctly, like the hourly costs are tens of thousands of euros, the
exactly.
daily costs are hundreds of thousands.
Exactly, right? So what that would mean if you don't have it is you're sort of fixing these documents, just sort of hanging out at sea for several hours, or in the worst case, maybe several days, right? That is just unnecessary cost just in the shipping operation, but also enormous opportunity cost because your customers from around the world are not receiving their goods. So
Right.
there's an opportunity also to streamline this whole process of document creation, reconciliation, the port authorities letting you go because everything is clear. I see that as an immense opportunity as well, and
Hmm.
something which I think AI agents are supremely well positioned to do. In fact, I think this is something which, in my mind, has to be AI led or certainly software led, but AI makes a whole lot of sense here. And it is one thing. So maybe taking a positive spin here, while all of this uncertainty is going on, if you actually transform the clearance process that we have at a lot of these ports, perhaps just the throughput that we see in a lot of these ports can and transit areas just changes, and that hopefully eases the burden, and
Hmm.
we maybe create more alternatives for goods to flow in the world economy.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So Orba is such an AI agent that is targeting the shipping managers and procurement managers that have to deal with constant changes, disruptions, alerts, and decision making on a daily basis. It's an incredibly stressful and chaotic job, um, which it has in common with being a manager on a construction site.
Yes.
So that's one of the reasons why we connect the logistics industry to this. The other one being we keep saying that when every now and then still we get asked by some uninitiated, hey, why is it that fundamental covers supply chain topics next to construction topics? The
Hmm.
answer is very easy once you start thinking about it. Both are project industries, which means the levers to optimize them are very similar. And two, construction is a supply chain business. So, in
Hmm.
order to optimize construction, you need to bring order into the chaos of its supply chains, which is why supply chains and logistics are way more interconnected with construction than people might think, right?
Hmm.
So, a fantastic, well run construction site is not well run because the local management team is looking at the best way to hammer a nail into the wall. It's because they are looking at the best way to organize its supply chain.
Hmm.
That's what a fantastic construction site actually looks like. And then slotting and scheduling all tasks and the teams, etc., against that, right? So it extends
Yeah.
onto the construction site. This chaos is the exact same thing on the reality of a construction site that deals with externalities.
I
When a
mean, going back,
shipment, yeah,
yeah,
go on.
I would say going back to your farm and farmer analogy, you can't really be a farmer unless you've also sorted out, when fertilizers come in, seeds come in, your irrigation system for moving water, right? When the crops are harvested, especially if it's a perishable product, or whatever, you need to figure out a storage system
Yeah.
or go downs for that, or you need to figure out the end customer fairly soon. If you haven't, the crop's going to rot, right? So being a farmer doesn't mean just growing the crop on soil. Similarly, being in construction doesn't mean just putting buildings together.
So, with all that chaos, the local management team on a construction site would equally benefit from very smart agents that can, perhaps listen to certain channels, but I think that's perhaps the less interesting part. Um, but definitely make sense of all the different updates that happen in real time, both software as well as in the channels, as well as perhaps offline, and bring them into a precision, into a decision priority order for the local management team to consider. So that's where I think it's quite equivalent. And another one which we're currently looking at, it's a live deal. I'll do something we never did on Practical Nerds. I'll actually reveal it right now. Very interesting company, which brings AI agents into port
Mhm.
operations. A company called Nodal, Nodal. Um, it's a live deal that we're looking at, and so there are a few interesting things here as well, where they bring the AI agent onto the shift management level of ports, because what that team has found out is that actually a lot of the bottlenecks that happen around port operations don't necessarily have to do with anything that happens before the port and after the port. They do have an influence, but they do have to do, for example, on a very granular level with shift handovers, where
Mhm.
oftentimes when the new crew comes into the port, they would actually have to look for a while until they become effective. What happened the hour before I started, before my shift
Mm.
started? What happened 2 hours before? So the handover of information is a real problem to the efficiency of port operations. And so LLMs can actually, again, it's a super vertical application of LLMs, can actually help make much more sense of the
Mhm.
shift handovers and the shift documentation organization for the crews.
Yeah, I would say it's an extremely potent application. And I think a few years ago, when I used to discuss shipping in general with few people in the industry, I think a lot of them would say, "Hey, like it's dead, it's boring, etc."
Yeah,
Which maybe it is, but if you just take
I
a
don't think so.
moment to ponder and pause and reflect on some of the things we discussed, and maybe even look around at the things, maybe wherever you are, just look around the things you have and how many of those things have been enabled because of shipping. I think you'll be blown away by just how profound the impact is if you can do something to transform that industry.
I've been a B2B person my entire life, my entire
Mhm.
business career. My mom had her own B2B company. I've been a B2B person my entire life. I think there's nothing cooler than moving atoms. I
Mm.
really think so. So when someone thinks like the gray, dirty industries are kind of boring, I can only be thankful, because that means there's one competitor less that I have to deal with. It's
Mhm.
such an awesome part of the economy.
Yeah, I would have to agree. Yeah, absolutely.
This was good. So I learned today where the term carried interest comes from.
Yeah. I mean, it's never too late, right, to know the roots of the industry you're in. So good for us.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke last week about how many, I guess, concepts we take for granted, and so this, I
Yeah.
like it. So, what is it you're taking for granted in your calendar next week?
So next week will be a slightly shorter week for me. But if you meant to ask what is perhaps a little bit exciting that I'm mulling over and
Sure.
thinking of, I think the one interesting thing which has in an interesting way, parallels to what we discussed about AI agents. It's something like an AI agent and productivity enabler, but for electrical grid operators, builders,
Oh,
installers,
I like
etc.
the sound of that.
Yeah. So I find it again like quite an interesting play.
We did discuss the components for grid infrastructure opportunity in an earlier Practical Nerds
Yeah.
episode. Like your memory is great. Do you remember which one?
If I had to take a guess, I would say maybe around 14 or 15.
Okay.
Somewhere in the, I would say, yeah, 14 or 15 would be my guess.
It must have been like October 23. So if you want to
Yes.
go back to our episode archive, that's where we discussed the opportunity for grid
Mhm.
components. Um, Look, in my calendar next week, I have a few monthly updates with some of my most favorite founder teams that I
Mhm.
have the fun to work with. Um, so
Nice.
that's what I'm looking forward to.
Nice. Very cool.
Good. Well, look, got smarter on logistics today.
I guess I'll chalk that up as a win.
Sure, I'll leave that up to you. You might prefer me dumbed down.
Oh man, I'll live with what I have. So, I'll take what I can get.
Ah, your your modesty knows no bounds.
I know. I mean that's I just amaze myself on a daily basis.
Yes. On that charming note, I wish you a wonderful week.
I wish you a lovely week as well, sir.
Cheers.
Cheers.